Local Control Funding Formula, State Policy Deliberation, and Education Budget Outlook, a webinar presented by Children Now.
I'm going to turn it over to Children Now's President, Ted Lempert.
Thanks, Jelena, and Happy New Year, everyone. It's already been a busy start to 2014, and really appreciate folks taking the time to join us for this webinar. Speaking of a busy beginning of the year, just as a note, I hope you've all had the chance to see Children's Now's Children's Report Card, which was released yesterday, is on our website and has a section on the local control funding formula and a range of other related issues related to kids. And speaking of a busy start to the year, as you're all aware, the governor will be releasing his budget this Friday, and then a major focus of this webinar is the State Board of Education meeting coming up on January 16th. And so as you'll see in a moment, those two items, the upcoming state board meeting and the budget for this next year, are really the key focus of today's webinar, which I know has generated a lot of interest. Do just want to note, I know a number of folks on this webinar have a particular interest in early learning, and we will be sharing later this month a toolkit and a number of other pieces of information for early learning advocates to work with their school districts to really help leverage the local control funding formula to expand early learning opportunities. So stay tuned for that information. And with that, no further ado, wanted to turn it over to Debra Brown, our Associate Director of Education Policy, to take it from here.
Great. Thank you very much, Ted, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. I thought I'd sort of go over what were our goals for the webinar today. And so, what we do want to do is sort of update folks on what's been happening since the last webinar. So at the end of October, we talked through what the situation was looking like with draft regulations that we're going to be going before the state board in early November. And so we'll provide a little bit of a review about what those regulations look like, and then what happened at the board meeting, and sort of fill in how we got to where we're at today. And then that's what we'll turn in, and Samantha's going to talk a lot in detail about what the regulations look like, and then our analysis of those regulations, and go over some of those details. And then also review how folks can stay engaged, and if you want to weigh in or provide messaging to the state board before the meeting next week, how you can do that. And also a little bit of information about what the meeting will look like and feel like, particularly since we have some insight given with the November meeting. And then we'll also talk about the state's fiscal picture, because as we all know, nothing happens in a vacuum. And so understanding what the state's improving fiscal picture looks like based on Prop 30 and the recovering economy means, we have some insight from what the Legislative Analyst's Office provided in November, and then we'll get more, that's sort of a preview for what the governor will do when he releases his budget in 2 days from now on Friday. And it'll be important to sort of have a little bit of context on that to understand how that dovetails with LCFF implementation, as that is really ramped up in this second year of implementation. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about what's happened since the last webinar. And so maybe it's important to review the questions, the key questions that are before the board and what they're trying to answer. And so the LCF legislation, as folks will recall, left some questions for the State Board of Education to define. And so that was, what does an increase or improved service for unduplicated pupils mean? And so the board is looking to address that. And in proportion to the increase in funds, a portion based on the number and concentration of unduplicated pupils. And then another fundamental question is on what is an appropriate restriction or allowable use for district, countywide, or school-wide purposes. So how those supplemental and concentration dollars can be used on district-wide purposes. And how the board in November responded to that is, this was really their first chance to take a deeper dive. You know, LCFF was enacted in June, and they had some initial discussion at July and September, but in their meeting in November, it was really the first chance to get a more detailed approach to it. And so based on those previous conversations, the draft regulations came out and provided options for school districts to meet those first two questions that the board has to ask, and then they also, has to answer. And so this was the first attempt to formalize that direction that had been provided, and then it also was obviously a good chance to respond to something. The challenge with those regulations is we felt that they fell short on meeting some of the key tenets and goals of LCFF, so that they didn't ensure that both flexibility and that the money would be used to benefit high-need students, and certainly, in our perspective, didn't define district-wide or school-wide in a meaningful way. And that was reflected in many of the comments at the board. So it was quite a meeting. There were nearly 200 people that spoke that morning, and I believe it was at about a 5-hour hearing on LCFF. So it was an important conversation to have, and one that hadn't really been sort of maybe crystallized it in a centralized way. And so those public comments, I think, were important, and the board heard from many parents who were very concerned that there would be no assurances that the supplemental and concentration dollars would be spent on high needs kids, those targeted students. And the board listened, and they were really grappling with what they had before them and then what they heard, and so they committed to addressing those concerns. And following that meeting, really the board staff it did an extensive outreach to stakeholders and tried to provide different reviews that intended to address those concerns and really primarily just live up to what the intent and goals of LCFF, but also the promise of LCFF and what it could mean for all students. And so following those, over the last 2 months, really, the board staff has provided a couple of drafts and a couple opportunities for folks to respond. And so there have been some important changes have been made, but there are some significant concerns that do remain. And so we see that the revised draft has a formula to establish what an increased or improved service means, which provides important transparency. That was one of those areas that we really did feel was lacking on the 3 options that were provided to the board. And so seeing that formula is an important transition away from something that was a little less clear. But we do continue to believe that they missed the mark on establishing the meaningful standard for district-wide and school-wide use of supplemental and concentration dollars. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Samantha to take a deeper look at what the new drafts mean, what they reflect. So Samantha?
So as Debra mentioned, we're going to take a deeper dive and really try and explain what we're seeing in the regs and provide enough information so that hopefully if people are looking at the regulations, they can understand the shifts that have been made, how this might play out across California as we move towards implementation. As with the last webinar, we're going to also try to provide an analysis based on some core principles, and these principles are very much rooted in the campaign around LCFF for many of the core supporters who are really pushing to get this done. A lot of the things that we talked about were and that the governor lifted up was this importance of having true flexibility in the use of resources so that local communities could respond in innovative ways to local needs, and at the same time demonstrating an increased investment and higher levels of service for high-need kids, so a real commitment to equity. And so both of those being core tenets of what we were trying to accomplish with LCFF, and that being grounded in what we know from good research and from on-the-ground practice, that being part of the larger push, which for us then translates into some very specific kind of guiding principles. And we just want to be very clear about what those are for us, because everyone will approach this analysis in different ways based on their vantage point. So we want to just make sure it's transparent what our vantage point is. We use 4 guiding principles as we think about this. 1, equity, and we ask ourselves the questions: do the regulations provide enough assurances that high-need students will receive additional supports? And so that's a core tenet. The other is flexibility, and that local stakeholders will really have an opportunity to innovate and quickly respond based on what they're seeing on the ground in a much more rapid-fire way and more effective way. Third, because law, statute, regulations are guiding practice, it's really important that we have a lot of clarity so that there's not confusion in the field. And so, we also look to whether or not the regulations provide enough information so that all stakeholders, that includes practitioners, oversight agencies, and parents, students, and the broader public, can really articulate what the intent is and know how to proceed. And then finally, the state's role. Is there appropriate accountability both on the fiscal side as well as what all of us care most about, which is outcomes for kids. So let's talk a little bit about this new formula. And I think it's important to note, as Debra mentioned, this provides important transparency, and it also retains considerable flexibility for districts, and I'll describe how that works. So it's a step-by-step process. The first step that districts, charters, and county offices will have to do is determine their starting point. So they're going to go and look at their existing expenditures and which expenditures are directed towards those increased services for high-need kids. And so that will be the first part of the calculation. They'll assess that this year. Also importantly, it's become clear in the regulations, which mirror statute, that by the time we fully implement LCFF, we're going to have to reach the full target. So those supplemental concentration dollars need to be used for the benefit of high-need kids. And so we have a target, we have where our starting point is, and then to be mindful that we want to make steady progress towards investing in high-need students, and knowing that that progress is very much linked to what does the overall resource picture look like in California. Districts are going to first have to, they'll look at this gap between their starting point and the ultimate target, and the investment level that they have to move towards is very much linked to the growth in the budget and the resources that they receive. And so it recognizes that this is going to be a slow transition process as we reinvest in public schools, knowing that we're coming off of many years of deep cuts, and we move to this new system. And so it provides enough clarity about how we're going to get there while still, being mindful of this transition time. In addition to the straight formula that we just described, districts will also be putting out a proportionality kind of percentage, where they will look at this proportionality will help describe the amount of investments that are happening. And so essentially you take the supplemental concentration dollars and you divide it by the base funding, and then that's something that you can articulate to the public about the increase in investments each year. And obviously, as you see through this chart, that will increase over time. Another important element related to transparency that we're very pleased about is that within the context of the LCAP, districts are then going to have to describe, how what kind of services they're providing. And so that provides an opportunity for community engagement, for practitioners to think about the work and to articulate that vision locally. So the next major piece is, as Debra mentioned, in addition to creating this formula that helps create better parameters around the dollars that we're talking about at the local level, there's an important provision within the context of LCFF that we were supportive of based on the research and just where we see good practice, that districts can use, and charters and county offices can use this funding, the supplemental concentration dollars, for systemic approaches. And this is really grounded in when we see effective intervention strategies and prevention strategies brought to scale, and district and school district-wide leadership around this, it can have a powerful impact on bridging the achievement gap. So for example, if there are a number of low-performing schools in a particular district, the district marshaling a team to provide assistance, having mentor teachers, having coaches, whether it's early learning strategies where we're trying to prevent the achievement gap before kids ever enter kindergarten. I mean, there's many examples of just really powerful approaches, both at the district-wide level and also at the school site level. And Title I also recognized the need to have these types of approaches. I think the fear was that if we didn't have this provision, you could end up having a $10 billion pullout program, and that may not be the best use of funds. So we want to, again, provide flexibility for districts and the school community and the larger community to really innovate. It's critical, though, that these provisions be clearly articulated, because I think there is the potential for a lot of confusion in the field, especially since this is a new approach. And so, in particular, this is a major issue. So what does the current regulations, the regulatory framework look like? Within the context of the framework, there are thresholds for when the funds can be used, but it's important to note that based on the language, a district below the threshold wouldn't be prohibited from using the money for these purposes. There's just different criteria, so we'll walk through that different criteria for above threshold and below threshold. The threshold at the district-wide level is a 55% threshold for district-wide. It's a 40% threshold for school-wide. So essentially, if you're in a school district with 55% or more unduplicated, that's low-income English learners, foster youth, students, you have a lot of flexibility in the use of resources. And below it, there's one more criteria that you have to meet. Similarly, in a school-wide context, if you have a school that's at 40%, quote-unquote, this unduplicated count of low-income English learners and foster youth, you can similarly use the resources school-wide, but below the threshold, you have one more criteria. So what are the criteria? Above the threshold, so for all districts, all charters, all county offices, they'd have to identify what the service is that's being provided. Secondly, they'd have to describe how those services are directed towards meeting the district's goals for unduplicated kids in the state priority areas. Excuse me. So that's the above the threshold. It's basically a description. Describe to us how you're proceeding. Below the threshold, there is one extra standard that would be used, and it's that you have to specifically explain how district-wide and school-wide uses are the most effective use. And similar to the rest of the LCAP county offices, county superintendents would need to review this language, approve it, and if it weren't approved, provide technical assistance. So that's what the framework looks like, but there are some challenges embedded that we see in the current version that we think is important to lift up and talk through. First, going back to Debra's earlier point about any provisions around describing or defining school-wide, district-wide, it has to be no more restrictive than Title I. And it's important to note that Title I uses a poverty measure, so it's 40% of kids living in poverty for school-wide uses. And at the district-wide, it's actually not allowable expense. We can't use Title I dollars for district-wide intervention or prevention services. It's a school, it's a school-driven model. So let me move on to the next slide real quick. First off, one of the things that we've been struggling with or having a conversation around is the difference between poverty and the unduplicated count. They're actually different definitions. So poverty, as you see from this chart here, the poverty line is an income of a family of four. It's about $23,000, a little bit over. In California, about 20% of our kids are living at the poverty level. When you start looking at free and reduced price meals, those income thresholds increase, and obviously we start capturing more kids. And so we start seeing that half of our kids are at the eligible level, 58% are at the reduced, it brings in more students. And then when you start including English learners and foster youth, primarily English learners just due to the definitions, that then kicks it up to 61%. So there are some distinctions there. And in addition to that, you'll see that the school-wide concentration thresholds that we're looking at, so a 40% threshold for a school-wide determination, it actually captures a lot of our kids. A lot of our schools actually have an unduplicated population that is of this mix. About 75% of our schools are in that category of above 40% threshold. And as you increase that threshold, it starts reducing. Even at 70%, a little over half of our schools still, have a high number of these student populations. So, this is an area where we think continued conversation is worthwhile as we move towards implementation and what it means to provide school-wide services. The other kind of piece that I think is important to note in the context of the regs is that for those districts and school sites that are actually below the threshold, there is this standard about the most effective use, which is new language in California, and so how that would be interpreted, especially without some objective criteria, it does become challenging when you think about implementation locally and some potential vagueness. So, these are areas that we're attuned to and looking at to try and figure out, what does this mean in terms of practice locally. So we talked a little bit about school-wide. The other important point is on the district-wide flexibility. When we do a breakdown of existing student populations, where they're at, what this means in terms of practical terms, about 80% of our unduplicated students are actually in districts that have a threshold that are above the 55% threshold. So most of our kids are actually, most of the kids who would be affected through the supplemental concentration dollars are actually in districts where there is this wide latitude in terms of investment. And even as we ratchet up the threshold, it's like we start seeing, there's still a pretty high percentage of kids in these different districts. So this issue around district-wide in particular is an area where it may be warranted to go in and clarify some of the language. So let's jump right to the analysis in terms of how we're seeing the combined package. Again, lots of progress in terms of transparency and a formula in place, which would be linked to the LCAP. And so it gives communities and practitioners a real opportunity to see what's evolving locally. But because of this vagueness around the district-wide, school-wide language, there is the concern that there's no specific level of service or funding that's required for high-need kids, or a differentiation there. And so the equity principle is kind of half met, and this will be the area where there's a lot of focus. Again, this does provide a lot of flexibility because districts are able to determine where they're starting from, and it will be, over time they'll be shifting in this direction, and they'll have wide latitude, obviously, in the types of services that they provide for high-need kids. So our third principle of clarity, again, where we see the need for clarity is school-wide, district-wide, probably district-wide in particular, just given the population of students that we're talking about. And accountability, again, it's the same issue. So the package as it's coming together is putting some fundamental building blocks in place, but this issue is a critical one. I do want to lift up the LCAP as well, because that's an important piece of the LCFF framework, and something that we've been very pleased that there is this concept of having the opportunity for communities and school leaders and practitioners to really engage together to create a vision at the local level and have a plan that articulates that vision and really lifts up some core priority areas that the state has, as well as local goals that can really set the trajectory around what locals are doing together and what progress they're making. And we think that the current template, I think this is going to be the space where we collectively are learning together, because this is a new concept. And so, as we see how this unfolds in the field, we'll need to go back and continue to make refinements. And the board and staff have said as much, that this is, that there's a lot of interest in kind of having an iterative process as we think about this regulatory framework. We're pleased that the draft provides a great level of transparency. You need to describe what the district goals are, differentiated by schools and subgroups as appropriate for both the state and local priority areas, and that you have to list expenditures related to those specific actions. So again, it's a new dynamic locally. It's a new way to present this fiscal data in a way that's more of a narrative. So as we look at the template and then again assess it based on these different principles, the equity principle, again, it provides a lot of transparency. especially how resources are going to be spent on high-need students, so that's good. Flexibility, again, allows broad flexibility for local strategies, for locals to come up with their own goals and then link the priority areas to that goal. I think there are areas, again, where we can continue to work to improve, specifically, having some clarity around standard definitions, so that as, within the context of the statute, there are a number of places where the legislature and governor pulled out of key indicators that we need to be tracking, whether it's dropout rates or different chronic absence and the like. And many of these things actually have standard definitions. Actually, chronic absence is one of those, where in statute we have a nationally recognized research-based definition of 10%. And so there may be some, by providing linkages to that statute, we could really strengthen and provide clarity about what's in law right now. And so these are areas we can fix. In addition, there are some other local measures that were included in the statute, such as surveys for parents and students and teachers, as these required, and so how we communicate that in the LCAP could be strengthened. In addition, on the accountability front, again, a lot of these data elements, the core information that districts will be reviewing, are things that they actually do provide to the state. Many of them are local, but there are a number that are statewide, and so having some standard way to really communicate that to the field, and for us collectively to be able to see where districts are starting and where they're moving in terms of progress would be useful, and having some standard definitions to help guide that process would again be useful. So, and I'm noticing here that our slide is a little off. We actually we'll fix it when we send it back out to folks, but they're on the accountability piece. It was more about this issue of having common data. So what's the key question that we believe is going to be helping to drive the conversation next week? And I think it really does boil down to this issue of school-wide and district-wide uses of supplemental concentration funding. The board in this has a lot of latitude, especially around the district-wide piece, to create some definitions. And so I know that there are numbers of folks really digging in, trying to figure out, how do we think about this together and make sure that we have the clarity in the field to implement the law. And there's been a lot of back and forth conversation about this. And so what I thought I would do is just provide a couple of the examples, and then I think by the time we get to the board meeting, there may be some more convergence around what the appropriate approach would be. So some of the examples could be to have higher thresholds so that you're, and that they were firmer, that they were actual thresholds. So that schools and districts below those thresholds couldn't use the dollars for these purposes. Again, I think there's a lot of research-based strategies that show that any community could benefit from these types of approaches, especially if they're prevention and intervention oriented. But I know this has been an area where there's been some conversation, especially at the school-wide level, that you may want to have some firmer thresholds so that we're getting the dollars to where a lot of the high-need kids are. Another idea that has been thrown out is having, within the context of the regulations, explicit definitions by which the county and communities and practitioners could judge what was an appropriate use and what wasn't appropriate use. Another strategy that we've heard been thrown out is maybe that only a certain percentage of the district-wide dollars can be used for these purposes, so that it doesn't all go towards these types of strategies, but that some portion of the dollars could be set aside for that purpose. And then finally, that there's some strengthening of the language, again, around this clarity issue of providing some stronger language that really articulates what might actually be the intent of the regs, but because of the way the language is laid out and it may not be coming through as clearly as folks intended, is to provide some language in there that just explicitly says that when districts are pursuing a district-wide strategy or school-wide strategy, that it's intended to provide a higher level of service for those students, even though it is a systemic approach. And so that's an area where I know there's continued conversation. So the next step, and this is much of a reiteration of our last webinar for folks who are gearing up and trying to find ways to engage. There are two primary strategies for engaging, and the time is short, so the timeline, this hearing is going to be on Thursday, January 16th, so next week. It'll start promptly at 8:30, and the board's going to do two things. They're going to, and this is why we have two separate agenda items, item 20 and 21. The first agenda item is the emergency regs, and these emergency regs are really important because they set the framework for this budget, this year. So the plans that districts are adopting right now that need to be adopted no later than the end of June, July 1st. These regs will dictate those plans, and these are 3-year plans. So it's about the resources that the state's about to invest in schools this coming year, and conceivably the 2 years afterwards. So these are very important plans, and so they'll be adopting those emergency regulations. At the same time, in the next agenda item, they will be adopting the process for permanent regulations, and the expectation there is that we'll be learning from the field about how this year's implementation went, and we'll have more time for engagement of all the different stakeholders, and it will come back before the board several more times. We've heard in terms of process, it may start over summer and in through the fall, so that there's really an opportunity to go back in and make some adjustments as we're seeing how it's playing out in the field. So a couple of tips in terms of letter writing. Now's the time to get letters in. And I think the next slide has logistics, but a couple of things about strategies in terms of be the most effective. You really want to make sure that to have the most impact, you very quickly talk about who you are and who you represent, and then have a very focused letter, ideally a page, at most 2 pages, that has very specific information about what you like about the regs, what you want to stay, any concerns that you have, language that should be removed and or modified, and if the language should be modified, then ideally you propose examples, because we are getting down to the wire. The board will adopt these regs next week, so it's really important to be very specific. Coalition letters are an effective strategy. Individual letters are also important. So these are good ways to engage with the board and the staff to make sure that information is getting out there. This logistical information, hopefully, again, you've all received the PowerPoint before the webinar, and so this has strategies for making sure you get your letters in. Make sure they get in no later than noon on Friday. And so again, it's a very short timeline. But it's important that it happens before that timeline so that it's in the electronic file that the board members receive. Now, you can also take copies with you if you're going to be there the day of the hearing and pass those out. You may want to bring at least 20 so all the board members have it and the staff. So in terms of testimony, again, the testimony is likely, because we're going to have such a volume of people, as Debra mentioned at the last hearing, we had over 200 speakers. I wouldn't be surprised if this next hearing is larger. So I think, just to be cognizant of everyone's time, the board is likely to implement most likely a 1-minute rule. It could be 2 minutes, but I would imagine it'd be more like 1, given the volume that we're talking about. So being concise is incredibly important, and making sure that you're hitting your high points right away. A strategy that may be effective for many is if you elect a spokesperson. The board staff has made it clear that if you have a group of 5 or more, you'll actually be provided more time. So that might be a way to make sure that if you really need to deliver a more nuanced message, that you come together with colleagues to make sure that you can do that. So again, the logistical information. It will be held at the California Department of Education. I know that there was efforts to look at another venue, just given how tight that space is and how it's not traditional to have this kind of volume. But there was nothing available at the state, so I know that staff really worked hard to try and accommodate folks, and are willing to work with groups to make sure that folks are comfortable during the public testimony process. And there's information there. If you are planning to bring a large group, connecting with the staff to give them the courtesy to try and help figure out the logistics for everybody. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Debra, who will talk a little bit about, why, the larger context and why the regulatory piece is so critical at this moment in time.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, this is shifting gears a little bit, but it's certainly talking about the fiscal picture and that we are in a different scenario, but we should approach it cautiously. We're looking at things very differently than what we were just 2 years ago, and so it's certainly important to set the stage about where we're at, and that obviously Prop 30 was a blessing for districts because it staved off the cuts, but it is we're starting from a very low point. So we were never, I shouldn't say never, in the last couple decades, we haven't been a very high funded state when you look nationally, and then to have $20 billion in cuts over a very short period of time, that put districts in a particularly precarious position. And so what we want to just, as we talk about budget numbers being good, is just again putting that in context. So we still rank 48th nationally in per pupil spending, and ranks 30th in per capita spending. So when you look at how we compare to other states per person, we rank very low. And then also, particularly when you look at where we're at on our per capita state and local taxes, we're 11th. And then obviously a shocking figure is the amount of money that we do spend on prisons. And so we rank second, so the second highest funded state of money towards prisons. And I'll make another little plug for the report card that Ted mentioned, where we do provide some charts and some more information that helps spell this out. And then so maybe a way of putting, what does 48th mean versus 20th is just looking at what California spent last year, or in the current year, excuse me, on average. So again, because we're still transitioning to where everybody is getting the same number, we still have to use averages, and make that comparison to what the national average is. And so when you look at that, that's a significant difference in how much money. So not only is the ranking important, but really how we compare to other states. And so obviously that what that means is because districts primarily spend their dollars on people, that means fewer adults are in our schools. And so that ranges from fewer teachers to curriculum specialists to counselors to administrators. Just fewer adults are on our school campuses than when you look nationally. And then but then moving forward, we do see that next year, if revenues come in as projected, that the state we can make progress in our schools, and so it's an important transition year from where we've been, and but it doesn't mean we're safe. So even if on the next slide next couple slides we're gonna talk about projections and what they mean, it's important to note that they are just projections, and that looking out, even looking out 2 years, it is very difficult, and that's why in this time we do need to look for a more permanent solution that helps avoid future cuts, but also provides more stability in funding, so that the districts aren't having such dramatic ups and downs from year to year. And that will help make a greater investment in our schools. And so the best information we have right now is some numbers that the Legislative Analyst's Office has put out in November in their annual fiscal outlook. And so you do see that really when we have better numbers, even going back 3 years, we have better numbers, and so we know that revenues over the last few years have increased over what was in the June budget. Some of that is just the way things are accounted for, and some shifting that Prop 30 did on accounting, but it does mean revenues going back even to 2011-12 are up. And looking forward and so what that will mean is that will mean some significant one-time funding for districts, because it will be sort of truing up the Proposition 98 guarantee. And projections moving forward are significantly higher. And so it's important to look at what next year means, which is really quite a jump in funding. And then also how that you see that it does taper off to the point where it's the next couple of years could see some particularly large increases, but then it does taper off. And so again, that sort of goes back to the idea that these are projections and really the need for a permanent revenue solution for schools. And so what does all of that mean for Proposition 98? And so, as I mentioned, because looking back and the revised projections for the last couple of years, it does mean that there's going to be some one-time funding and then some ongoing increases for schools, because as we know, Proposition 98 is based in part on general fund revenues, state general fund revenues, as well as local property taxes. And so if we look at the higher revenues in 2012-13 and 13-14, that means the state needs to provide $4.8 billion in one-time funds, again, because it's just going back, and there will be a corresponding increase in ongoing, but there's some one-time funds available to make sure that the Prop 98 guarantee was fully funded. And so those two fiscal years will see increases, and so it does mean some important dollars for schools, as well as both ongoing and one-time funding for schools. And so, as I mentioned, this is the these are based on the Legislative Analyst's Office estimates, but the governor will release his proposed budget, and then will include his administration's estimate of revenues, which may be different. I don't think it will be so different to show that there won't be significant increases, but the numbers might differ. And he'll actually be releasing that on January 10th, not the 15th. So that's just in 2 days from now. And this is an important, it's important because this will outline the governor's perspectives on how new dollars should be spent. And so it will certainly drive much of the conversation over the next few months as the state figures out how it wants to make these investments. And so, there's some important ways that we could use one-time dollars, because they can help the state pay down debt for schools, and so deferrals being a very large one. And so that was during the state's fiscal crisis. There's an accounting maneuver that allowed the state to delay payments to schools, and so the state owes schools, and really what it means for districts if the state were to do that is that they would get their dollars on time rather than late, sometimes several months late. And so that's would be an important way to use those one-time dollars as well. And then also the state has a significant backlog of mandate claims. So this is where the state requires districts to do things, and they need to be reimbursed for that. And so those are good ways, although there's certainly other debt that would be an important use of that. And then we do think that another important use of this would be the continued investment in Common Core and the next generation science standards, and helping districts implement those new standards, and then also help them as they move towards the assessments that are aligned to those standards. And we'll see the current budget did provide $1.25 billion for districts, and so that's an important investment. But and districts do have 2 years to spend those dollars, but it is an excellent use of the one-time dollars, particularly as we see what happens this spring with the new assessments. And then looking at the ongoing dollars, you see that there's a significant increase in funding for Proposition 98, and so the chart below, and again, those are projections of where the Prop 98 guarantee will be. So you do see some fairly significant steady increases, and this is important because the growth in the Prop 98 guarantee will allow the state to make significant investments towards meeting the LCF funding target. And so that will be an important conversation to have to determine how much of those dollars will be will be allocated for LCFF implementation, and it will be important to make sure that those that they are used in a way to help get districts to their targets. And then we do see a significant projection of $74 billion for Proposition 98. But again, going back to that first slide under this fiscal conversation, is that it doesn't make up for cuts in recent years, and it really certainly doesn't address the significant underfunding that schools have. But still an important part of the conversation and will help districts meet their goals. And sort of bringing it back to why, bringing it back to LCFF and why it's important to get the rules right, because this is this could be a significant year of investment in LCFF, and if there are not sufficient safeguards in place to make sure those dollars are spent on those students, it could mean it really could mean a lost opportunity to address need, and it certainly could be detrimental to meeting LCFF goals and tenets that we've talked about earlier. And so we've got some additional resources for folks if it helps. Again, Department of Education has some great information on LCFF and also WestEd, and then of course Children Now. And then I did provide a link to the Legislative Analyst's Office. So if folks were more interested in a better understanding of sort of what all of those numbers on those slides mean, the Legislative Analyst's Office does have some information on there that will be helpful. And then also some definitions. So we do use a lot of jargon and acronyms that a little bit helpful just to keep a reminder of what these mean. And so with that sort of wraps up the slides that we have for you. And so we appreciate everybody's participation and the increased interest in folks in understanding these very complexities, but they're so important. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ted to see if we have any questions that we can answer.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. We have a number of questions. The first is a pretty simple answer. Will the text of the governor's budget presented be available before the 10th? The answer is no, other than those of you that follow state politics, unless someone in the Department of Finance mistakenly presses the wrong button and it gets released before then. Otherwise, it's officially released as coming Friday morning. Deborah, go ahead.
I would just add, Ted, I mean, sometimes things do get out. You get sort of little tidbits and little snippets of what might come out, but yes. No, details definitely not till the 10th, and that will be at 9 o'clock on the 10th.
Great. And then for Sam and Deborah, a couple questions on school climate related issues. I'll put two of these together. One, is it possible that the State Board of Education will add definitions for the chronic absenteeism rate and attendance rate to the LCAP? And then why not specify a specific school climate survey in the LCAP?
Yeah, those are certainly areas that we're hopeful will get clarity moving forward. I mean, especially with the chronic absence definition, where we have an official definition in statute, linking to that seems appropriate. So I know there's a lot of conversation and desire to have those shifts. It will just require folks really voicing that through both letters and showing up and working to promote those specific changes.
Sam, a similar question. Why are the priority indicators like suspension rate and expulsion rate not better defined?
Yeah, I mean, one of the areas that we've talked about with the board and staff is the desire to, and actually early in November, part of the documentation that was released to the field was an indication of potentially moving in this direction, hopefully, around having some common data that's pre-populated by the state, especially since a lot of those data elements are already reported. And so having a standard format that folks can look at across local education agencies would be useful. And then we're seeing where folks are starting and the progress that's being made. And so that's all really important. You know, within the context of the definitions, I think this is an area where additional clarity would be useful.
And this might be an area where, when we shift to the discussion on the permanent regulations, that a lot of the focus has been on the fiscal side of it and less on the template in the conversations, and so it's an important area that hopefully will be better focused as we talk more about the LCAP and the permanent regs. And then honestly, as districts really are adopting their first LCAPs, I think the conversation will be better informed.
Great. Next question, how is the State Board approaching guidance on using LCFF funds for pre-K, TK services?
As folks know, the statute is pretty clear that the funds can be used for this purpose. There's a wide latitude in terms of the types of services and supports that high need, in terms of investments locally. I know that there was an effort, a coalition effort, to reach out to the board and staff around providing some more clarity on this front, because as we implement a new law, these questions come up, and I think the educators historically are more conservative, and so they're going to be careful, obviously, to make sure that they have the flexibility that obviously we're all seeing in the statute. We have heard that in addition to the formally adopted regulations and the LCAP template, the board and CDE plan to issue a non-binding kind of guidance document where they'll provide additional information and really support the field to think through their local processes, to lift up some really important issues, and to provide this type of clarity. And it does sound like that some language will be in that guiding document that makes it clear that the funding can be used for this purpose.
Great, thanks. Do the regulations, proposed regs, detail consequences for districts not meeting reporting requirements?
So the way this is going to work, I mean, as we're seeing it unfold, and Deborah, please add if there's anything I missed. The districts will put forward their plans linked to their budgets. They'll approve it, obviously at that local level, charters as well, and county offices as well, and then it'll go to that higher level of review. And so for school districts, they'll be submitting it to their county office of education, who will be reviewing the plan pursuant to statute and the regulations, and approving or disapproving the plan, primarily based on the specificity in the regs, and the statute. So there's initially a very limited focus in terms of more on the fiscal rules, that piece of it. And so the counties will, if they don't approve of the particular plan or template based on those provisions, they need to go in and provide technical assistance to a point to where the plans can be adopted. At the same time, we're also mindful that another layer of work will be around the audit guides and that state role or that state audit provision, and that process is in the works too. So there's still some additional work that needs to be done on that front. I don't know if that answers the question or if you have anything else to add.
No, I think it is an important question that there's not a clear answer, but there are some things that particularly the audit guide, that's a separate process.
So we have a number of more questions, so we'll try to get through 4 or 5 here in the next 4 or 5 minutes. So the next one is long. I'll read it very quickly. In the LCAP template before, it had language about creating a parent advisory committee for oversight. Now it only has oversight from existing advisory committees such as School Site Council, English Language Advisory Committee, and Student Advisory Committees. Is this correct?
So we actually saw that the language to be more inclusive, and so the statute, again, the regs modify the statute. So the statute says that the district has to provide the plan in advance to an advisory council, which can include, but need not necessarily include, but can include existing advisory committees. And then there was language about how it has to be aligned with school site plans. The new template has, I think, stronger language that talks about also allowing school site councils to weigh in a more kind of formal way, which just assures another layer of kind of engagement. Again, these are essentially minimum standards, and we're seeing many districts across the state really trying to figure this out and having open forums and taking the forums on the road and doing lots of different ways to begin the conversation with their community and whittle that conversation down through the budget timeline. Obviously, this is going to really heat up fast, given that now that we have a template from which they can work and a very short timeline by which they have to finalize it. We are hopeful that we'll see even more work being done on this point. But I do think that the template is actually a little bit more inclusive than what we saw in November.
Great, thanks. Next question, how do these funds apply to the special education student population?
So special education was purposely kept outside of the LCFF format, I mean, in terms of the funding model, because we have a separate funding formula for special education that is actually, there's a state level task force right now that is digging into this issue in particular to look at, is the architecture around that funding formula still on target? Are there things that we need to shift? So that conversation is certainly happening. In terms of the template is clear that the districts and charters and county offices need to look at their subgroups. And so special education is an identifiable separate subgroup that needs to be discussed within the context of the template.
Great. We got 3 more.
There's one other point on that. Well, I was just going to say the other piece that I would mention is that there was some additional clarity within the template that you can cover multiple funding streams in terms of your plan, and that you just have to highlight where those funds are coming from. So again, I think that's a nice way to get the entirety of a district's budget and how it's being deployed towards a strategic plan.
Great, thanks. So we got 3 questions in 3 minutes. Has there been any information on how showing growth will play out or complement the future of standardized testing / Common Core? So I'm not sure if that was phrased clearly enough, but do you understand the basic gist of the question? Go ahead.
I get it, and it's the next big policy issue that is going to be so fundamental in California as we make this transition to Common Core and we're bringing on online a new assessment system. It really does open the dialogue around our outcome accountability system and the state's role and what locals, that kind of interplay between state and local. We don't have clarity at this moment. The LCAP doesn't narrowly define that. So it provides a lot of guidance around locals beginning to develop their own local plans and setting some local benchmarks, which will be informed by community engagement. It is an important part of the process. In terms of the statewide framework, that I think is going to be the next big policy conversation in California, and a really important one, because obviously we all fundamentally care about kids' outcomes as being the core issue of importance.
So we had a number, but we'll cover 2 more here. Is there any specific reference to the needs of new teachers, including intern teachers?
There's not that's not specifically called out. There may be something in the guiding document, but I haven't actually heard of any particular focal point on that. Yeah, I think that's going to be a local determination at this point.
Great. And then I guess a fitting last question, which I'm not sure you can make whatever guess you'd like, given the focus has been on the upcoming state board meeting on the 16th. The question is it likely that the state board will make further refinements at that meeting?
I think that there's going to be a lot of folks coming to bear to put forward requests. There may be some really great ideas that bubble up in that context, and we're hopeful that the board will continue to hear and reflect those good ideas. And obviously, as we stated before, the area that I think we're hearing is of main importance and certainly of significant importance for us is this issue around district-wide and just going in and provided that clarity that is needed to give some good direction to the field. But I think there will be a robust conversation, to say the least. We've been hearing numbers, very large numbers, so we'll see what manifests, but it's going to be a big conversation.
Great. Well, thank you. It's 2 o'clock, so we're going to close up the webinar now, but we'll be sending you the audio, and certainly feel free to contact us with additional questions. Really appreciate the very significant interest in this absolutely critical issue, and certainly a lot going on with the governor's budget this Friday and then the upcoming state board meeting. So thank you very much, and look forward to soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.